Hi class, welcome to chapter 11, prisons and jails. So we're going to be talking a little bit about how prisons evolved and what the current status is with different types of prisons. So today's high rates of imprisonment, which is often referred to as evidence of mass incarceration in the United States, are the result of many strategies. This came from truth in sentencing guidelines, relatively long sentences for gun and drug crimes, 3 strikes, habitual offender laws, and judicial freedom to incarcerate convicts for relatively minor criminal behavior. So the prisons of the 18th century England were known as Bridewells, after London's Bridewell Palace, and it really had little to do with punishment. These facilities were mainly used to hold debtors or those awaiting trial, execution, or banishment from the community. And there was these colonial administrators, and they were more likely to use corporal punishment than their English counterparts, and the death penalty was really not uncommon in early America. The one dissenter of this was William Penn, and he adopted the Great Law in Pennsylvania in 1682. This was a criminal code, and it forbade the use of torture and mutilation as forms of punishment. And instead, felons were ordered to pay restitution of property or goods to their victims. What a concept. So in Walnut Street Prison, which was the first penitentiary, it was in 1776, and it was from Pennsylvania legislation passing that ordered offenders be reformed through treatment and discipline rather than simply beaten or executed. So Pennsylvania continued this process, this reformist view, and opened the first penitentiary in a wing of Philadelphia's Walnut Street Jail in 1790. So the penitentiary operated on the assumption that silence and labor provided the best hope of rehabilitating the criminal spirit. At the same time, enforced labor would attack the problem of idleness, so regarded as the main cause of crime by those who were studying criminology. So eventually this penitentiary at Walnut Street succumbed to the same problems that continue to plague institutions of confinement. There was overcrowding and excessive costs. So there was this great rivalry with penitentiaries between the Pennsylvania system versus the New York system. And the apparent lack of success at Walnut Street did little to dampen enthusiasm for the penitentiary concept. So each state tended to have its own peculiar twist on the roles of silence and labor in two such systems, those of Pennsylvania and New York, which emerged to shape the debate over the most effective way to run a prison. So the Pennsylvania system took the concept of silence as a virtue to new extremes. And based on this idea of separate confinement, these penitentiaries were constructed with back-to-back cells facing outward from the center. And this was to protect inmates from corrupting influence on others. Prisoners basically worked, slept, ate alone. Kind of like solitary confinement is now. Now, the New York system comes along and builds this prison. It's called Newgate Prison. It was built in 1791, and it became overcrowded quickly. So the state authorized the construction of Auburn Prison, and that opened in 1816. So Elam Lins was the warden at Auburn and instills the congregate system, which was known as the Auburn system. And like Pennsylvania's separate confinement system, the congregate system was based on silence and labor. Inmates worked and ate together with silence enforced by prison guards. The Auburn system proved more popular, and a majority of the new prisons built during the first half of the 19th century followed New York's lead, though mainly just for economic reasons rather than philosophical ones. In the 1870s, a group of reformers argued that fixed sentences, imposed silence and isolation really did nothing to improve prisoners. So the reformers presented this ideology that would heavily influence American corrections for this next century. This new penology was put into practice at New York's Elmira Reformatory in 1876. And at Elmira, good behavior was rewarded by early release, and misbehavior was punished with extended time under a 3-grade system of classifications. Now we're starting to sound a little more like common day prison standards and principles. So these progressives believe that criminal behavior was caused by social, economic, and biological factors, and therefore a correction system should have a goal of treatment, not punishment. And they trumpeted a medical model for prisons. And this held that institutions should offer a variety of programs and therapies to cure inmates of their ills, whatever were those root causes. What a concept, right? So then there was this reassertion of punishment. So prison administrators usually did not agree with the progressives and their followers, so the day-to-day lives of most inmates varied little from the congregate system of Auburn Prison. And academic attitudes began to shift away from the progressives in the mid-1960s. The publication of Robert Martinson's famous What Works essay provided opponents of the medical model with statistical evidence that rehabilitation efforts did nothing to lower recidivism rates. So let's talk about kind of the role of prisons in modern day society, and then we'll break down these different types of prisons. So prisons exist to make society a safer place, and whether this is to be achieved through retribution, deterrence, incapacitation, or rehabilitation really depends on the operating philosophy of the individual penal institution. So there are 3 general models of prisons that have emerged to describe the different schools of thought behind prison organization. There's the custodial model, which I'm trying to find. Give me a second, guys. I need to... I think that... Oh, I went right past it. So here we are. There's the custodial model, and that's based on the assumption that prisoners are incarcerated for reasons of incapacitation, deterrence, and retribution. The rehabilitation model, which stresses the ideals of individualized treatment. And the reintegration model, which is where the correctional institution serves as a training ground for the inmate to prepare for his existence in the community. So there are differing viewpoints. Professor Alfred Boomstein argued that prisons create new criminals, especially with regard to nonviolent drug offenders. And not only do these nonviolent felons become socialized to the criminal lifestyle while in prison, but the stigma of incarceration makes it more difficult for them to obtain employment on release. So really their only means of sustenance on the outside is to apply the criminal methods they learned in prison. So how are prisons organized and managed? So the United States has a dual prison system that parallels its dual court system. The Federal Bureau of Prisons, the BOP, currently operates about 100 confinement facilities, ranging from prisons to immigration detention centers to community corrections institutions. Governors are responsible for the organization and operation of the state correction system, which definitely vary based on the state's geography, their demographics, and definitely their political culture. So those offenders that are sentenced in federal court for breaking federal laws will serve their time in federal prisons. And offenders that are sentenced in state court for breaking state laws serve their time in state prison. So let's talk about prison administration. And whether the federal government or a state government operates a prison, its administrators have the same general goals. The mission of the prison is to keep prisoners in, to keep them safe, to keep them in line, to keep them healthy, keep them busy, and to do it with fairness, without undue suffering, and as efficiently as possible. So in some respects, the management structure of a prison is similar to that of a police department. So both systems rely on a hierarchical top-down chain of command to really increase personal responsibility. Both assign different employees to specific tasks through prison managers, and those managers have much control over the subordinates than the actual police managers might. So the main difference is that police departments have a continuity of purpose that is sometimes lacking in prison organizations. So the warden is ultimately responsible for the operation of a prison. He or she oversees the deputy wardens, and those ones are managing the various organizational lines of the institution. And the custody employees who deal directly with inmates and make up more than half of prison staff operate under a militaristic hierarchy, chain of command, kind of like in law enforcement. And there's a line of command that passes from the deputy warden to the captain to the CO, correctional officer. So when we talk about what needs to happen when we're governing prisons, really there's so many implications of prison management. Political scientist John DiGiulio believes that in general, the sound governance of correctional facilities is a matter of order, amenities, and services. So order can be defined as the absence of misconduct, such as murder, assault, rape. And amenities are the comforts that make life livable, such as clean living conditions, acceptable food, entertainment. Services is programming, so education, voc training, remedial education, as well as drug and alcohol treatment. And according to the same study and same research, in the absence of these three things, order, amenities, and services, inmates will come to see their imprisonment as not only unpleasant but unfair, and they will become more and more difficult to control. So classification is a process. In our state, when offenders receive a sentence into prison, they go to Shelton, which is on the west side, and that's where classification happens. It's really a very important aspect of administration because it looks at an inmate's mental, physical, and security needs and evaluates them, and then determines the best correctional facility fit for that inmate. And taking the results of the process into consideration, prison administrators generally rely on three broad criteria for the classification: the seriousness of the crime they committed, the risk of future criminal or violent conduct, and the need for treatment and rehabilitation. So this will then help determine their custody level, and this is their security designation. So we have some different types of prisons, and it usually is classified under their custody level. So custody level is the security designation that's given to inmates. So of course we have a maximum security prison, and those who compile extensive misconduct records are usually housed along with violent and repeat offenders in maximum security prisons. These are designated with full attention to security and surveillance. Their lives are programmed into a militaristic fashion, and it keeps them from escaping and also from harming themselves or others. Maximum security prisons tend to be large, and they hold more than 1,000 inmates usually, have many similar features. It's usually surrounded by concrete walls that stand 20 to 30 feet high and also have been sunk deep into the ground to deter tunnel escapes. Fences are reinforced with razor ribbon barbed wire that can be electrically charged, and that may supplement some barriers. So the prison walls are studded with watchtowers, and cells are located in rows of cell blocks, each of which form its own security unit that's set off by a series of gates and bars. And within maximum security prisons, inmates' lives are dominated by security features. There's usually television surveillance cameras that are used to monitor their moves, constant head counts. And so then we have supermax prisons. About 30 states and BOP, the Federal Bureau of Prisons, operate supermax prisons. And these are supposedly reserved for the worst of America's corrections population. Many of these inmates in these facilities are high risks to commit murder while behind bars. So supermax prisons are also used as punishment for offenders who commit discipline infractions in maximum security prisons, or if they get highly involved in prison gangs. So different jurisdictions have different definitions of what constitutes a supermax, but the most reliable survey estimates that about 60 such facilities exist in the United States, and that houses about 25,000 inmates. And the main purpose of the supermax is just to strictly control the inmates' movements. For the most part, supermax prisons operate in a state of perpetual lockdown. And what that means is this is where inmates are confined to their cells, and social activities, meals, recreation, sports, treatment programs are really non-existent. So then we have medium security prisons and minimum security prisons. And medium security prisons hold about 45% of the prison population, and minimum security prisons 20%. If an inmate is at a medium security prison, they have for the most part committed less serious crimes than those housed in maximum security, and they're not really considered at high risk for escaping. So consequently, because of that, medium security institutions are not designed for control to the same extent that maximum security prisons are. Now, in a minimum security prison, this isn't a correctional institution, but it's way more relaxed. This is going to be designed to allow inmates who really are low risk, and it gives them a lot of freedom and movement and contact with the outside world. So what do we see that is driving population growth? So let's talk about the factors that have happened over the last several decades. So in 1980, about 19,000 drug offenders were incarcerated in state prisons and 4,800 drug offenders in federal prisons. And 35 years later, state prisons held about 209,000 inmates who had been arrested for drug offenses, and the number of drug offenders in federal prisons had risen to 97,000. So for most of the 1980s, these crime rates in the United States were much higher than they are today. And in addition, during that decade, the likelihood of incarceration in a state prison after arrest increased 5-fold for drug offenses, 3-fold for weapon offenses, and 2-fold for crimes such as sexual assault, burglary, auto theft, and larceny. And what happened is we had these get tough laws. These laws that, in sentencing, that basically were a reaction to the spike in crime in the 70s and 80s. And these measures, which included sentencing guidelines, mandatory minimum sentences, truth in sentencing laws really hit, and we had a significant jump in inmates and how much time they were serving. Inmates released from state prison in 2009 spent an average of 9 months, about 36% longer behind bars than inmates that were released in 1990. So on the federal level, in the 15 years after the passage of our SRA, the Sentencing Reform Act of 1984, the average time served in federal prison increased more than 50%. So just for some statistics for you guys, between 2000 and 2015, the federal prison population grew by 56%, from about 125,000 to over 196,000. And this had a lot to do with federal drug offenders. And other factors that were driving this federal prison population growth included when in 1987, Congress abolished parole in the federal corrections system. So federal inmates must and are required to serve their entire sentences, minus good time, of course. And the number of federal inmates sentenced for immigration violations increased by more than 850%. Crazy. In 2017, nearly 12,700 female offenders were behind bars in federal prison. That's 75% more than in 1995. So what do we do about this? How do we process decarceration? Decarceration policies rely on 3 methods to reduce the number of offenders in prison. We need to decrease the probability that nonviolent offenders will be sentenced to prison. We need to increase the rate of release of these nonviolent offenders. And we need to decrease the rate of imprisonment for probation and parole violations. So this can all be steps that we can take. Incarceration has so many severe social repercussions for communities and families that make up the communities. Studies link high imprisonment rates to increased incidence of sexually transmitted diseases and teenage pregnancy, as the separation caused by incarceration really wreaks havoc on interpersonal relationships. After being released from prison or jail, these men and women suffer from higher rates of physical and mental health problems that the rest of the population does not struggle with. These problems have a disproportionate impact on these families. So this brings up private prisons. This has changed greatly with Biden coming into presidency recently. I don't know a whole lot about it, but I did say he was eliminating private prisons. I need to read more into that. But as private prison numbers soared at the end of the 20th century, these state correction officials faced this problem. We got too many inmates. So private prisons were created, and these are correctional facilities that were operated by private corporations instead of the government, and therefore they will rely on profits for survival. And so the reason that they wanted to do this, or privatize some of the prisons, was mainly financial. So private prisons are often run more cheaply and efficiently than public ones because of labor costs and competitive bidding, less red tape. So private prisons are becoming increasingly attractive to state governments that are faced with the competing pressures of tight budgets. The problem that I have with, and many people have with private prisons, is how are we holding these owners of these prisons responsible for following standards and policies when it's not a government agency, it's a privately owned prison. And is there some shady things going on between judges sentencing people to certain jails and who owns the jails or the prisons? Just, I think, opens up potential issues. So when we're talking about the difference between jails and prisons, the main thing we want to know is that in our state, if you're sentenced to over 365 days or longer, you will go to state prison. So a jail, and this is a great graphic here that breaks it down, I think, in a great way. Jail is often the first contact that people have when they are arrested. Really, the biggest thing is that they're being held either pre-trial or right after arrest. So they're called pre-trial detainees. They've been arrested for a variety of reasons. They're just unable to post bail, so they are held there. There was a Supreme Court ruling in 1979 called Bell v. Wolfish, and the Supreme Court rejected the notion that this situation is unfair by refusing to give pretrial detainees greater legal protections than sentenced jail inmates have. That is unfair. So about 38% of those who have been convicted, of those in jail, have been convicted already of their current charges. In other words, they've already been found guilty and they are being held there at the jail because they have a time sentence that is less than a year. At least here in Washington, the year mark is what we're using. I think it can range from state to state. So, of course, we have, other people that are in jail. Of course, this ranges. You can see all of these different things. Immigration law violators, juveniles awaiting transfer. There can be a number of different types of people that are in jail. With jails, they're really operating on a principle of a fee system. So the sheriff's department's reimbursed by the government agency for the cost of housing them. And jails can be really difficult to manage because of all the different reasons that people are there. And there's just such a lack of resources, mental health, physical health, disabilities that inmates have, that jails just don't have the funding like prisons often do. So new generation jails, really most of jails in the United States have continued to resemble that Walnut Street jail in Philadelphia. And in traditional or linear design, jail cells are located along a corridor. And this is good for supervision and for structure. Now, there's often greater opportunities for treatment in these new generation jails, but to be able to do that, there has to be some different designs. So there's, in traditional or linear design, jail cells are on the corridor, which I think I just said that. And what people do is they, to supervise them, they're going to just walk the corridor. But in this new generation jail, it called for interaction and greater opportunities for daily exercise and eating, showering, being in those pods. So that's the idea of this pod design, where you're usually going to have corrections officers that have continued visual contact throughout the pod. So that does it for our prisons and jails. You can watch so many shows on TV about the different jail, real shows about different jails and types of jails and how jails are managed. And I would highly recommend that, especially if this is an area of interest for you. Have a good night.